I started noticing this weird feeling every time I walked past certain areas in my home. Not messy enough to look alarming or anything. Honestly, most of it looked pretty normal. But mentally, it felt heavy. There were things I hadn't used in months, sometimes years, and somehow I was still carrying them around every single day. Or worse, I had shoved them into drawers and baskets just so I wouldn't have to think about them anymore. And I realized clutter usually doesn't happen because we're lazy. A lot of the time, it happens because we keep delaying decisions. Things we meant to fix. Things we spent too much money on. Things we thought we'd eventually become the kind of person to use. Things connected to versions of ourselves that honestly don't exist anymore. Individually, none of these things feel like a big deal. But when hundreds of tiny, unfinished decisions pile up together, your home starts to feel loud. So before going into a new year, I wanted to do something different. Not completely reinvent my life, not become an extreme minimalist. I just wanted to stop bringing unnecessary weight into 2026 with me. And surprisingly, the hardest things to let go of weren't actually the objects themselves. I think one of the biggest reasons clutter builds up is because we keep buying for imaginary versions of ourselves, not who we are right now, who we think we'll become someday. And honestly, I found so many things like that in my house. Clothes for a lifestyle I don't actually live. Books I thought would magically turn me into a more disciplined person. Random hobby supplies for hobbies I tried for maybe 3 days before forgetting about them completely. And the hard part is, those things don't look useless. That's why they stay for so long. Every time you pick them up, your brain immediately goes, well, maybe eventually, maybe later, maybe next year. But eventually I had to be honest with myself. Some of these things weren't supporting my real life anymore. They were supporting this fantasy version of me that I kept feeling guilty for not becoming. And weirdly, that's exhausting, because now every object becomes a tiny reminder of something unfinished, something you failed at, something you thought you'd be better at by now. I had skincare products for a girl with a perfect nighttime routine, workout stuff for a girl who wakes up at 6 a.m. consistently, cute notebooks for a girl who journals every morning while drinking lemon water or whatever. Meanwhile, the real me is just trying to survive a normal Tuesday, and I think decluttering became easier once I stopped asking, could I use this someday? And started asking, does this actually support the life I live right now? Because trying to store every possible version of yourself inside your house eventually creates so much mental noise, even if the room itself still looks clean. I used to think clutter only counted if you could actually see it, like piles on the floor, overflowing shelves, stuff everywhere. But honestly, some of the most overwhelming clutter in my house was completely hidden. The drawers stuffed with random cables, baskets full of things I said I'd deal with later, cabinets packed with items I forgot I even owned. And what's funny is those spaces don't usually look dramatic. Most people would probably open them and think, oh, that's not even that bad. But mentally, those spaces were exhausting. Because hidden clutter still takes up mental space, your brain still knows it's there, even if you're pretending not to think about it. I noticed I had all these tiny areas around my house that felt unfinished. Not dirty, just unresolved. Like little pockets of delayed decisions everywhere. Stuff I needed to return. Things I meant to donate months ago. Random objects I moved from room to room because I didn't know where they actually belonged. And I realized organizing it wasn't really solving the problem either. I was getting very good at hiding clutter in prettier containers, which honestly is still clutter. I think that's why certain areas in the house started feeling weirdly heavy, even when they looked clean. Because the issue wasn't visual anymore, it was mental. Every drawer became this tiny source of low-level stress, and the longer I avoided those spaces, the worse they got. Because clutter loves procrastination. The moment you stop making decisions, everything starts piling up quietly in the background. So this time, instead of trying to perfectly organize everything first, I just focused on making actual decisions. Keep it, donate it, trash it, relocate it. That's it, because I'm realizing more and more that sometimes the most peaceful homes aren't the most organized ones. They're just the homes with fewer unfinished decisions hiding behind closed doors. I think one of the hardest parts about decluttering is realizing how many things you're only keeping because of guilt. Not because you love them, not because you use them, just because getting rid of them feels uncomfortable, especially when money is involved. There were so many things in my house that instantly made me think, I spent way too much on that. And somehow my brain convinced me that keeping the item would make the purchase hurt less. But it doesn't. If anything, it just keeps reminding you of the mistake over and over again. And I started noticing how often I was doing this, keeping skincare that didn't work for me, holding on to clothes I never reach for, saving random gadgets I used once because throwing them away felt wasteful. But the truth is, the money was already gone. Keeping the item doesn't bring the money back. It just turns your house into a storage unit for regret. And honestly, I think a lot of us confuse guilt with responsibility. We think being responsible means forcing ourselves to keep things forever because we bought them. But sometimes being responsible actually means admitting, yeah, this didn't work for me. That's it. No dramatic life lesson, no huge failure, just a normal human decision that didn't end up being worth it. I also realized clutter gets really emotional when an object represents the person you want it to be. Because now, you're not just letting go of the item, you're letting go of the expectation attached to it too. And that can feel weirdly personal, but I don't want my house filled with things that quietly make me feel bad every time I look at them. I'd rather have less stuff than constantly carry around visual reminders of guilt, pressure, or unfinished self-improvement projects. At some point, I had to stop asking, but what if I need this someday? And start asking, why am I letting this object emotionally control me in the first place?
One thing I noticed while decluttering is that the biggest problem usually isn't the big stuff. It's the tiny things, the random receipts, dead batteries, loose papers, half-used products, duplicate items, pens that barely work, chargers for devices you don't even own anymore. None of these things seem important individually. That's why they survive for so long. Because your brain keeps thinking, it's just one small thing. But then you realize your entire house is full of hundreds of small things. And together they create this constant visual noise that slowly drains your attention without you even realizing it. I noticed this especially on flat surfaces. Counters, nightstands, chairs, tables. Every surface slowly became a temporary holding area for unfinished decisions, stuff I needed to put away, things I meant to deal with later, random objects that technically didn't belong there, but somehow lived there permanently. And what's scary is how fast your brain gets used to it. You stop fully seeing the clutter after a while, but your nervous system still reacts to it. You still feel mentally crowded, even if you don't consciously notice every object anymore. That's why I think clutter can feel exhausting, even when your house doesn't look that bad. Your brain is still processing all of it in the background. And honestly, I think this is why organizing alone never fully worked for me. Because sometimes I wasn't reducing the amount of stuff. I was just rearranging the same overload into neater piles. This time, I tried focusing less on creating perfect systems and more on reducing friction, making it easier to clean, easier to find things, easier to reset the room. Because I don't actually want a house that looks perfect for 5 minutes. I want a house that feels easier to live in every single day. And weirdly, getting rid of tiny, useless things made a bigger emotional difference than removing large items ever did. I think sentimental clutter is hard because it doesn't feel logical. It feels emotional immediately. You pick something up and suddenly you're not looking at the object anymore. You're looking at a memory, a season of your life, a version of yourself, a person you used to be close to. And because of that, we end up keeping way more than we actually care about. I noticed this especially with old keepsakes and random memory boxes. There were things I had saved for years that I honestly forgot even existed, and when I finally looked through them again, I realized something kind of uncomfortable. Some of these items weren't actually meaningful anymore. I just felt guilty getting rid of them because they used to mean something once. And I think there's a difference. Not every memory needs a physical object attached to it forever. There were things I kept because I thought I was supposed to keep them. Birthday cards, old school stuff, random souvenirs, tiny sentimental objects that had been sitting untouched in boxes for years. And when I asked myself, if I found this item today, would I choose to keep it again? The answer was honestly no a lot of the time. I also realized I was holding on to certain objects because they represented a time in my life I didn't want to fully let go of yet. And that part felt weirdly emotional. Because sometimes clutter isn't about the item itself at all. It's about your attachment to a moment that already passed. But at a certain point, keeping every single reminder of the past starts making it harder to fully live in the present. So instead of trying to keep everything, I started choosing a few things that actually still carried real meaning. Not just guilt, not obligation, not fear of forgetting, actual meaning. And honestly, I'd rather have a few sentimental items that I truly love than boxes full of things I never look at but still feel emotionally responsible for. The more I decluttered, the more I realized I don't actually have a cleaning problem. I have a decision problem, because most clutter starts as something incredibly small. I'll deal with it later. I don't know where this goes yet. Maybe I'll use it. Maybe I should keep it just in case. And then those tiny delays start stacking on top of each other for months, sometimes years. That's why clutter can build up even in people who are actually pretty organized. Because organization doesn't stop delayed decisions. Sometimes it just hides them better. I noticed there were so many things in my house that existed in this weird in-between state. Not important enough to use, not useless enough to throw away. Just sitting there, waiting for future me to finally decide. And honestly, future me was getting really tired of inheriting all those unfinished decisions. I think that's also why clutter feels heavier during stressful seasons of life. Because when you're mentally overwhelmed, decision-making gets harder. So instead of deciding, you postpone. You put the object in a drawer, move it to another room. Tell yourself you'll come back to it later. But later keeps multiplying, and eventually your house starts reflecting your mental backlog. That realization honestly changed the way I look at decluttering. Because now I don't really see it as cleaning anymore. I see it as reducing the number of unresolved things constantly competing for my attention. And weirdly, the more quickly I make small decisions, the less overwhelming my home feels overall. Not because the house became perfect, but because there's less unfinished business sitting around everywhere. I think that's why small, daily decluttering works so much better for me now than waiting for one giant motivation burst. Because the goal isn't to become a perfect minimalist overnight. The goal is to stop letting tiny, unmade decisions quietly pile up in every corner of your life. I honestly thought the biggest reward from decluttering would be having a cleaner house, but weirdly, that wasn't even the best part. The best part was how much quieter everything started to feel. Not physically quieter, mentally quieter. I wasn't constantly moving things around just to use a space. I wasn't opening drawers and immediately feeling stressed. I wasn't seeing random unfinished projects every time I walked into a room. Daily life just started feeling easier. And I don't mean in some dramatic, life-changing way where suddenly everything became perfect. That's not real. I still get messy sometimes. I still procrastinate. I still leave things out when I'm tired. But there's a huge difference between a lived-in home and a home that constantly overwhelms you. Before, it felt like every room was asking something from me. Clean this, organize that, deal with this pile, figure this out later. Now it feels more like the house is actually supporting me instead of silently draining me all the time. And I think that's what I was really looking for this whole time. Not perfection, not aesthetic minimalism, not a Pinterest house, just less friction, less visual noise, less guilt, less avoidance, less pressure coming from my own environment every single day. Because when your home feels calmer, your brain gets a little calmer too. And honestly, I don't think decluttering solved my life, but I do think it removed a lot of unnecessary weight that I didn't realize I was carrying around for so long. So going into 2026, I don't really care about owning as little as possible. I just want to be more intentional about what deserves space in my home and what no longer deserves space in my mind. I think one of the biggest things I learned from all of this is that clutter doesn't usually appear all at once. It builds quietly, one delayed decision at a time, one junk drawer at a time, one I'll deal with it later at a time. And eventually you wake up feeling overwhelmed in a space that technically doesn't even look that bad. So no, I'm probably never going to become one of those people who owns 15 things and lives in a completely perfect house all the time. That's not really the goal for me. I just don't want my environment constantly adding pressure to my life anymore. I don't want every room reminding me of unfinished tasks, wasted money, old versions of myself, or things I've been avoiding for years. And honestly, decluttering didn't magically change my life overnight, but it did make everyday life feel lighter, a little easier to reset, a little easier to breathe in, a little easier to exist in. And I think that matters more than having a perfectly organized home ever could. So if you've been feeling mentally overwhelmed lately, maybe the problem isn't that you need to work harder or become more productive. Maybe there are just too many unresolved things quietly competing for your attention every single day. Anyway, that's what I've been trying to leave behind before going into 2026.